The very last part of this process, using mass percent data or combustion analysis initially, is to determine not the empirical formula of a compound, but its actual molecular formula for a non-ionic compound. So how do we go about doing that? Well, the molecular formula is simply the empirical formula times some whole number. Remember that the empirical formula is simply the smallest whole number ratio of elements, whereas the molecular formula is actually the actual composition of the molecule with the actual number of atoms, not simply the smallest whole number ratio. And so we can simply take the empirical formula and multiply it by some whole number to get to the molecular formula. Now, we can determine the empirical formula from the molecular formula. That's very straightforward, but without any additional information, we cannot determine the molecular formula directly from the empirical formula. We need additional information to be able to help us figure out what this whole number is. And so we can get that, whole number information if I knew the molecular weight and I knew the empirical formula. So we determined the empirical formula using maybe combustion analysis. If I knew what the molecular weight was, then as long as I know what, then having figured out what the empirical formula is, I can then find this whole number scaling factor simply by taking the overall molecular weight and dividing it by the empirical formula weight. Now, we'll go through an example of this, but you may wonder, so where would I get the molecular weight from? Well, there are certain tools. One is known as mass spectrometry, which will not give you the molecular formula, but it will give you the actual molecular weight for the compound. And so if you took that technique and determined the molecular weight, and then coupled that with the information from a combustion analysis, where you could get the mass percent data and then determine the empirical formula from that mass percent data, then you would know both the molecular weight and the empirical formula. From the empirical formula, you simply add up the atomic weights and you would get the empirical formula weight. And this would now allow you to get this whole number scaling factor that we need to be able to determine the molecular formula from the empirical formula. All right, now let's do this practical example. Ascorbic acid, again, we're revisiting it. It has a molecular weight of 176.12 grams per mole. What is the molecular formula for vitamin C? Now, this is relying on the previous videos where we determined the empirical formula for ascorbic acid or vitamin C. So remember that we determined that to be C3H4O3. So now I have a molecular weight, I have an empirical formula. I simply have to figure out what the empirical formula weight is, which is simply adding up the atomic weights. Put the molecular weight on top here, and I will divide through and come out with this whole number as being just 2. So the actual molecular formula then for vitamin C is simply the empirical formula scaled by 2, and so the actual formula is C6H8O6. Let's do another example. So returning to this valproic acid example that we have carried all the way from the beginning with the combustion analysis, we determined the empirical formula of that already to be C4H8O. And maybe we determined now the molar mass or the molecular weight to be 144.211 grams per mole, and perhaps we got that from a mass spectrometry experiment. It didn't give us any other information, it simply told us that the overall molecular weight was 144.211 grams per mole. So what is the molecular formula then for valproic acid? Well, it's again very straightforward. The whole number scaling factor is simply the molecular weight divided by the empirical formula weight. So we take the molecular weight, divide it by the sum of the atomic weights in the empirical formula, and I come out and find that my scaling factor is 2. So my molecular formula then is simply the empirical formula times that scaling factor, and is thus C8H16O2. for valproic acid. That is how we determine the molecular formula using combustion analysis to find mass percent data, then the empirical formula, and then coupling this with the molecular weight.